In the vast emptiness of space, where stars bear silent witness to the rise and fall of civilizations, humanity faced its darkest hour. The Axiom Annihilation fleet hung in the stardusted Gulf, hundreds of vessels, shaped like sharpened splinters of polished jet, arranged in a flawless geometric array. Their hulls drank the starlight, creating patches of absolute blackness, where distant suns ought to be dot below their web of perfect order. Earth was the struggling fly, its orbital defense grid, a string of fading, winking embers as the Axiom dismantled the last human stations with the detached care of an archivist shelving old books. The encrypted channels that should have screamed defiance offered only a chorus of static and automated distress calls at digital death. Rattle. Most species would have met such an annihilation fleet with a counterfleet, a desperate last stand of fire and metal. But humanity chose a different path. They sent Dr. Emery, a quiet man who preferred the company of petri dishes and chemical formulas. His primary weapon? A deep and abiding understanding of how things fall apart. The military high command had walked him through the psychological profile of the fleet commander. High Strategos Volker, a being of supposed perfection with a single exploitable flaw. He is an artist, General Awa had rasped, a connoisseur of the abnormal. His battle arrangements, while strategically sound, always contain a flourish. Another analyst pushed a data slate across the table. Testimony from a captured hierarch. He called them flawed artifacts from lesser cultures. Volker is a collector of broken things, Doctor. He finds beauty in chaos. And so humanity bet the entire species on a single horrifying premise. They didn't send a soldier to fight a general, or a diplomat to negotiate a treaty. They sent a predator to a connoisseur of predators. Emery, humanity's foremost expert on the deconstruction of the Axiom species, knew their breaking points better than anyone alive. When Emery's shuttle docked with the Axiom flagship, the Symmetry's edge, he stepped into a vast, sterile cathedral of order. The chamber was so perfect in its dimensions and lighting that it felt less like a ship and more like a geometric proof rendered in 3 dimensions. 2 Axiom guards monoliths of silent, disciplined death flanked him as he walked through halls that were all masterpiece of cold alien architecture. Walls flowed into floors in perfect sweeping curves, etched with geometric patterns that glowed with a soft internal light. But Emery wasn't seeing architecture. He was performing a non-invasive autopsy. Every glowing pattern revealed power flows vulnerable to induced resonance. Every vibration through the deck plates whispered the superstructure's resonant frequency. Each surface he touched told him of thermal shock tolerances and acid hydrolysis vulnerabilities. He paced the length of the coffin he intended to build for them. They brought him before High Strategos, Volker in a grand observation chamber. One entire wall was a viewport, showing the besieged Earth in stark, silent, devastating detail. Blue oceans, swirling white clouds, and the angry red blossoms of orbital impacts. Home, Volker stood with his back to the view. He was even taller and more serpentine than his guards, his movements possessing a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. A simple dark robe clung to his slender frame, his elongated head tilted slightly as Emery entered, his black pupilless eyes fixed on the human with an unnerving intensity. And so the deadly game began, a chess match between 2 predators where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the human race. The game of cat and mouse played out across the perfect corridors of the Symmetry's edge. Emery moved with calculated purpose, his seemingly clumsy exterior hiding a mind sharper than any blade. With each passing hour, he planted the seeds of destruction throughout the vessel, silent, patient poisons that would blossom into catastrophe. On the second ship rotation, under the pretense of studying the unique atmospheric composition, Emery was granted a supervised tour of a life support nexus. He feigned academic fascination as he analyzed the chamber, a web of humming machinery, and conduits glowing with internal light. The ship's lungs, with a feigned stumble and a spilled container of purified water, he created his moment, that half-second of distracted guard attention. His other hand moved like a striking viper, slapping a small polymer patch onto a coolant conduit. The adhesive was instantaneous, the patch invisible to scans. Over the next 72 hours, that innocent-looking patch would degrade the coolant, subtly reducing its thermal transfer efficiency by a fraction of a percent every hour. The change would be insignificant at first a ghost in the machine. But as the degradation compounded, it would create a chain reaction of heat management failures across the entire ship. Emery's next target was the ship's nervous system, the biogel network. In a deserted maintenance corridor, he found a pulsating translucent mass of gel, threaded with billions of fiber optic filaments. It was alive. With surgical precision, he micromachined a sample collection syringe into a sharp injector, filled it with a corrosive solvent, masked within a nutrient solution, and carefully spliced it into a secondary data node. The biogel, sensing nutrients, would eagerly absorb the poison and circulate it through its own body. But as he worked, the distinct prickling sensation on the back of his neck told him he was watched. And then he heard a faint melodic resonance, hung in the air for a moment before fading. The same tones as Volker's voice. The confrontation was direct. Volker found him in the sterile arboretum, a chamber filled with bizarre flora of faceted bismuth that chimed softly in the recycled air. The high strategos circled him like a shark, his movements fluid and silent. "I have been monitoring the propagation of the thermal inefficiency you introduced," Volker began, his voice a low purr. "Fascinating. It follows a chaotic but predictable mathematical decay." With a wave of his hand, Volker showed real-time maps of every act of sabotage Emery had committed. "Do you understand, Doctor? I am letting this experiment run its course. You are giving me the blueprint to your species' chaotic soul. Every act of sabotage is a data point, a verse in the epic of human desperation. I will learn how you think, how you break things, and then I will design the perfect unbreakable cage for your entire species." And so the sabotage continued, but its nature changed. The covert operation morphed into a deadly dialogue tutorial. Emery worked openly, and Volker became his silent shadow, his audience of one. Their conversations became a duel of philosophies conducted. Over the humming machinery, Emery slowly poisoned. "You believe your individuality is strength," Volker would muse, watching Emery's fingers on a console. "I see it as a design flaw. A million separate wheels pulling in a million different directions. It's called resilience," Emery would retort. "If one of us fails, the rest adapt. If you fail, Volker, what happens to your perfect order?" Volker would simply smile, as if the concept of his own failure was a logical impossibility dot in the sterile silence of his quarters. Emery mapped out his endgame. The mission was no longer about crippling the flagship. It was about decapitating the entire Annihilation fleet. His trap had to be irresistible. It had to target Volker himself. And most importantly, the final stage needed a backdoor to the starless dark. Emery initiated the final sequence with a simple chemical reaction in a service junction that shorted out a minor power relay. It was the first gentle push, and across the ship, his dominoes began to fall. The degraded coolant he had engineered days ago finally reached its critical point. Unable to compensate for the minor energy fluctuation, heat sinks flashed red on display shipwide. Seconds later, the poisoned biogel, pushed to its computational limit by the heat crisis, finally corrupted a core command packet. A chain reaction of system glitches erupted across the bridge. Phantoms appeared on long-range sensors. The ship, believing it was under attack while also suffering critical heat failures, automatically began to shunt power to its main weapon systems, just as Emery knew it would. Then he triggered his final device in the biolab, brilliant silent flash of light, a massive release of inert but visually dramatic vapor, and the shriek of a dozen localized alarms. Volker arrived at the biolab just as Emery predicted. Glowing energy fields sealed the corridor as the high strategos swept through them. A calm island in a sea of controlled panic. The chamber beyond was a carefully orchestrated scene of chaos. Emergency lights strobed in thick swirling vapor. Pipes that Emery had pre-scored vented harmless steam with a terrifying hiss. Volker's guards moved to follow him in, but he raised a single hand, halting them. "Wait here," he commanded. "This is not for your eyes." His expression held only transcendent, ecstatic focus. He was not a commander walking into a crisis. He was a scientist about to witness the sublime final result of his grand experiment. Volker approached through the swirling steam, his serpentine form cutting through the chaos like a phantom. He stopped a few feet from Emery, his black eyes shining. "You are like me," he said, his voice filled with a tone of final triumphant discovery. An apex predator, ruthless, intelligent, a monster in all but name. Emery stopped his frantic act. He turned slowly from the console, and the panicked scientist was gone. His face was suddenly chillingly calm. "The difference between us, Volker," Emery said, his voice flat and hard, "is that I chose a side." In one fluid explosive motion, Emery lunged. As he moved, his thumb brushed a control on his repurposed geological scanner, sending a silent localized EM pulse that scrambled the bioelectric signals from Volker's brain to his muscles, just long enough. Exploiting the high center of gravity he had noted days ago, Emery slammed Volker hard against the reinforced inner door of the waste disposal airlock. Volker didn't struggle. Pinned against the cold metal, he simply looked at Emery. The expression in his vast black eyes held neither anger nor fear. It was something that looked unbelievably like pride. A serene final understanding. The klaxon for the airlock cycle screamed, and the massive outer door began to iris open to the hard vacuum of space. Volker raised one of his four-fingered hands and pressed it against the inner door's thick viewport. His thin lips moved, and through the ship's internal comm system, a single whispered word, laced with awe and admiration, reached Emery's ear as the inner door shot open. "Beautiful." The instant Volker's command signal vanished, the Axiom Annihilation fleet descended into civil war. The perfect network designed for one absolute voice fractured. Volker's second-in-command aboard the Symmetry's Edge immediately attempted to assert control, but on another capital ship, the Perfect Vector, an ambitious rival commander, did the same. Ships began receiving contradictory orders. Just beyond sensor range, a waiting human fleet had one simple, elegant instruction: jump the instant the Axiom Command Authority signal ceased to exist. That signal vanished. 100 human warships tore into reality. They found a fleet locked in a brief, vicious, and utterly self-destructive battle. They fell upon the bewildered warring Axiom like a pack of wolves. Amidst the pandemonium he had created, Emery navigated to an escape pod and launched himself into the gulf between worlds. The small craft streaked away from the dying flagship as a human destroyer slammed torpedoes into its midsection. He watched the battle rage, a decisive victory forged from a lie. He had won. Humanity would survive. As his pod oriented toward Earth, Volker's final haunting word echoed in the silent cockpit. Beautiful. Emery stared at his home, the place he had just saved through an act of monstrous, beautiful destruction, and a terrible, undeniable truth struck him. He was the predator who chose to be human, to make the choice to be kind and protective rather than cruel and destructive, wasn't he? A proximity alert cut through the silence, followed by the gentle shudder of a tractor beam. A voice, warm and human and crackling with static, filled the cockpit. "Rescue craft Rusthound to unknown human pod. We have you. Welcome home, Doctor." The transition was jarring, beautiful shock. One moment he was in a sterile, silent cocoon. The next, the pod hatch was cranked open into a corridor buzzing with life. The air tasted of ozone, sweat, and hot coffee, the smell of humanity, overwhelming after his time in the sterile Axiom vessel. On the bridge of the human flagship Defiance, Emery watched the Axiom fleet, now a field of shattered splinters and blinking distress signals. When he confessed to General Oda that Volker had seen him as a monster and called his work beautiful, the general placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. He saw a predator, the general corrected, his voice low but firm. He was right. But a predator isn't a monster, Doctor. A predator is a survivor. Its purpose is to ensure its own kind continues. You just reminded the galaxy what it means when humanity decides to survive. As Emery looked at the fierce joy, the grim determination, the sheer beautiful chaotic humanity of the bridge crew, his hands, which had been clenched into tight fists since he'd stepped onto the Axiom flagship, finally uncurled. The cold, precise chemist who had built a weapon of galactic consequence, the predator who had stalked his prey through a perfect metal tomb, felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with physics or chemistry. Across the stardust void, the last remnants of the Axiom's perfect, silent order were broken against the loud, messy, indomitable will of a species that refused to go quietly into the dark. They had sent their artists of annihilation, their architects of oblivion, their flawless geometric fleet. Humanity's answer echoed back across the cosmos, not in a single perfect note, but in a chorus of 1 billion defiant voices. A symphony of beautiful, terrible, unbreakable rebellion. Their perfect equation had been solved. The answer was human.